Fifth graders. Today we are going to start our exploration in different forms of payment, and we're really going to focus on what are the different kind of forms of payments that you can use when you go to purchase items, and what would be their advantages and disadvantages to those different forms of payment. This is part one. Tomorrow you'll have part two. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to start with is discussing the check. And if you've ever paid for anything with a check at school and your parents wrote a check for something, you're familiar with what it looks like. A check is basically just a written document used to withdraw money and pay for goods from a bank account. Okay. Before we start talking about the advantages and disadvantages of a check, I want you guys to go ahead and get some paper out, and we are going to set up your notes. I would like you to set up your notes in the following manner. So if you need to pause the video right now and get these supplies to be able to do so, go ahead and do that, and then I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, so I want you to be sure that you set up the notes in the following way. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of paying with a check. So write them down in your notes as I talk about them. You can just write them. There'll be two advantages, so you could write the first advantage, put a comma, and then write the second advantage in your notes. And then move to where it has a negative sign. That's going to represent the disadvantages that you could face using a check. There's two of them. So you can write the first one and then put a comma for the next one. All right, so let's move on to the advantages and disadvantages of a check. Okay, one of the really good advantages to writing checks to pay for items is that it keeps a record of the money spent. Most checks have little duplicate papers underneath them, and when you fill out and write the check, you have a documentation right there of payment. Which is good, because if a creditor or a bill or a company ever says, hey, we didn't get a payment from you, you can pull up the information and say, yeah, it was this check number, I sent it to you on this date. And then you can also go back and check in your bank for when they cash the check. So it kind of keeps a running documentation of your spending. And it's also harder to steal than money. When you pay for a check, they require that you show identification with a driver's license. So that kind of gives you a level of protection that you may not have with a debit card, credit card, or cash. It requires proof of that you are that person who is using that check. And there's also a signature portion on it as well. Some disadvantages to using a check might not be that not all stores accept checks any longer. And you may go to the front and want to pay with a check, and they are pretty much a cash card restaurant or store of some kind, and you wouldn't be able to use it. So you have to kind of check to see if the company or the place you're buying an item for will accept a check. It does take time to fill out and check out at the checkout counter, because it requires the cashier to check for documentation. You have to fill it out. So there is a little bit more time involved in it. And the other thing you have to be careful with a check is that there are bank fees for bounced checks. And basically, you only have a certain amount of money in your account. And if you spend more than what you have, the bank will charge you fees. I think my bank charges us $30 for any bounce checks. So you just have to be really careful about making sure you have enough money in your account. You don't spend more money than you have. All right, so we're going to move on now to talk about a credit card. The next slide is just going to tell you and give you an explanation of what a credit card is, and then I'll show you the notes again of how we're going to set it up for the next part, okay? Okay, so a credit card is a small plastic card used to purchase goods or services with money that must be paid back to the interest in the bank or institution. So as you see, you kind of go to the store and you give this card to the place that you're purchasing something, and it's paid for from the bank. Whatever credit card company gave you this credit card is attached to a bank, and the bank says, yeah, we're going to pay for that purchase for you. So the money comes directly from a borrower. It's kind of like a loan. And then you pay back the bank with interest. Okay, so it's your money, but you have to pay any interest that you owe on the card if you don't pay it off right away, which we'll talk about in a second, because obviously that's going to be a little bit of a disadvantage coming up here. Okay, so our next step is we're going to go over the advantages and disadvantages of a credit card. Go ahead and set up your notes for your next form of payment. Follow the same note-taking process as we did before. For any advantages, you're going to place those on the plus line. For any minuses, you're going to place it under your minus line, okay? Plus means advantage, minus means a disadvantage, kind of like a positive, negative thing, okay? All right. So there are some advantages to using a credit card. A credit card allows you to buy it now and pay later. This is good for big purchases. For example, probably about 3 months ago, our refrigerator went out. And a refrigerator is something that is as a necessity in the household, but they're very expensive. And we didn't have the $2,000 we needed to buy a new refrigerator or freezer. So we were able to put it onto a credit card and do a buy now and pay later process, and we are able to get a really good interest rate, which was 0% for that purchase. And so it allowed us to be able to, as a family, get that refrigerator and freezer that we needed and pay it off when we could, because that was a big purchase. I think it ended up being like a over $2,000 for the refrigerator and freezer we picked out. Okay, so that is an advantage with a credit card. You can buy something now and then you can pay for it later. And especially if emergencies arise, like needing to replace your washer and dryer, needing to get a new refrigerator, freezer, things like that. The other advantage to a credit card is it's accepted at most places. There's not a lot of places that you can go these days that will not take a credit card. So that's a good advantage for the credit card. Some disadvantages you need to be aware of when paying with a credit card is that you can end up paying more than you spent, and it's called interest. Every credit card has a different interest rate. You can have a good credit card would probably be somewhere around the 12% rate. Some other credit cards can charge all the way up to 20% on a purchase, and if you were to do the math on a $100 purchase, and let's say you didn't pay it off by the end of the month, 20% would be what you would pay additionally to that. And so I'm just going to do some math right here. I've got my little phone calculator if I can get it pulled up. All right. So say you bought an item that was $100 and you were paying 20% on it, your interest could be almost upwards to $20 extra for that purchase based on how long it takes you to pay it off. So you got to keep that in mind that it does allow you to buy now and pay later, but there's usually an interest charged. So you pay more for the item than you would if you had the money to pay for it up front. The other disadvantage for a credit card that you have to be careful of is that you can end up spending more than you have. These credit card companies can give you a limit of almost up to $5,000 or $10,000, or you might have a really high credit limit. And you're like, woo, look at all these things that I can buy. But what you have to keep in mind is you have to be able to pay it back. So just because you get a credit card with a limit up to $5,000 doesn't mean that you do not pay it back. And that's where some people can get in trouble with credit cards. You max out your credit card and then you don't have the means to pay it back. And you can be taken to court for not paying your credit cards off. And creditors will follow you. So you just have to be really responsible with credit cards. They're necessary to build good credit, but at the same time, they can get you into trouble if you don't act responsibly for them and have a plan to pay them off in a timely manner. Okay, so those are the advantages and disadvantages of credit cards. So the next one, hold on. Oh, there we go. So what happened here? I think I skipped over something. Yep. Okay. So the next one we're going to talk about is a debit card. And you can hold off on your notes and just listen to what a debit card is. Okay. So a debit card is a small plastic card used to purchase goods and services, and it's using money from a person's bank account. So as you can see right here, this credit card does not get paid for by a bank. It goes directly to your bank account. It is sort of like a plastic check. It's connected to your bank account. So when you go up and pay for it, most of the time the debit card is the one your parent might use that's required to use a PIN to use it, which gives another level of protection. And it is linked directly to your checking account. So you don't have to pay interest on this one. It's like a plastic card that represents electronic payments from your bank account. Okay. All right. So we're going to set up our notes for the advantages and disadvantages of a debit card, and then we'll move on to those next. Okay. So this is kind of how our notes are looking so far. Okay. All right. On to the advantages and disadvantages of a debit card. All right. So some advantages of a debit card are that it's accepted at most places. Like a credit card, most places will take it. Okay, the other advantages is that the card's connected to your bank. You pay for it immediately from the money you have in your bank account, and you don't have to pay interest on it. The one disadvantage to a debit card would be that you must keep track of how much money you have, or that card will be rejected at checkout. And that can be kind of embarrassing. That happened to me when I was, first starting out as a teacher and kind of living paycheck to paycheck. You've got to be careful, because then you end up having to put back items, or just putting all your purchases back and then just come back for it later, which can be embarrassing. So there are your advantages and disadvantages for a debit card. And at this point, we're done with all of our forms of payment for today. This is part 1. We have part 2 tomorrow. Okay, so here's an example of kind of what your finished notes should be close to looking like. This is part 1, forms of payment. You need to make sure that you take a picture of these and upload them to your picture evidence slide attached to this assignment. I want you to be sure to remember to turn in when both assignments are done for today. You have a defend and decide that you should have finished in your Google Docs, and then you should also insert a picture to the picture evidence slide, and then you can turn the assignment in when all the parts are done. That blue turn in button. Okay. All right. So tomorrow we will meet again to discuss forms of payment part 2. Take care.